If you're going to work here, you'd better start by learning how to clean up after the people who actually matter, my boss said, loud enough for the entire office to hear. The words hung in the air like a bad smell that nobody wanted to acknowledge. It was a Monday morning in early October, the kind of crisp fall morning where the sunlight comes through the tall glass windows and turns every dust particle into a tiny floating star. Our office sat on the 12th floor of a modern building in downtown Chicago, and normally the place felt busy and professional. But at that moment, everything felt different. Dozens of eyes were on me. Some curious. Some uncomfortable. A few quietly amused. Greg Collins, the regional operations manager, stood a few feet away with his arms crossed, staring at me like he had already decided exactly what kind of person I was. On the floor beside the main conference table was a wide streak of dark coffee that had clearly been spilled during the morning rush. A yellow plastic mop bucket had appeared from the supply closet, and Greg nudged it toward me with the tip of his polished shoe. "Well," he said, "don't just stand there." I looked down at the mop handle resting against the bucket. The office around me had gone unusually quiet. Someone's keyboard stopped clicking. A chair creaked as someone shifted their weight. I could feel the tension spreading across the room the way ripples spread across water. I had only been working there for 3 weeks. Officially, I was just another junior analyst hired during the company's recent expansion. No one knew much about me, and that was exactly how I wanted it. I kept my voice calm. "Sure," I said simply. Then I picked up the mop. A few people exchanged looks. I could see it out of the corner of my eye. One of the younger employees, Jason, leaned toward the woman next to him and whispered something under his breath. She gave a quick shake of her head, like she couldn't believe what was happening but didn't want to get involved. Greg watched the entire thing with a faint smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Good," he said. "At least you know your place." The mop head dipped into the cloudy water with a soft splash. I wrung it out slowly and pressed it against the floor. The sound of wet cotton sliding across polished tile echoed farther than it should have in the quiet room. I worked carefully, pushing the mop forward and pulling it back again, the same steady motion over and over.
"No rus. No hesitation. Just calm."
Someone behind me cleared their throat awkwardly. Another person shifted a stack of papers that didn't really need moving. The whole thing probably lasted less than a minute, but it felt longer, like the room itself was holding its breath. Greg finally spoke again. "Maybe next time you'll think twice before leaving a mess around here." I didn't bother correcting him. The coffee wasn't mine. Everyone in the room knew that. But I also knew something else they didn't. I rinsed the mop once more and straightened up, resting both hands on the handle for a second as I glanced around the office. The city skyline stretched across the windows behind us, steel towers glowing in the autumn sun. Somewhere down the hall, an elevator chimed softly. Footsteps approached the reception area outside our department. At that exact moment, Greg was still watching me with that same satisfied expression, completely unaware that the next person about to walk into the office was the one individual in the entire building who would change everything. I rinsed the mop slowly and set it back against the yellow bucket, the wheels squeaking slightly as I pushed it toward the supply closet near the break room. The office was still quiet in that strange, uncomfortable way that happens when everyone witnesses something they know is wrong, but no one wants to be the first to say it out loud. A few people returned to their screens, pretending to be busy. The soft tapping of keyboards gradually started again, uneven at first, like rain beginning after a dry spell. Greg Collins adjusted the cuffs of his expensive suit jacket and glanced around the room with the expression of someone who believed he had just restored order. "All right," he said sharply, clapping his hands once. "Back to work. We have an important morning ahead of us." That was technically true. Everyone in the building had been talking about it since last week. Whitmore Global, one of the largest investment groups in the country, was rumored to be evaluating several mid-sized companies for acquisition. Our firm had landed on the shortlist. That meant executives had been walking on eggshells for days, trying to make everything look perfect. Desks had been reorganized. Old files had been boxed and moved. Even the reception area downstairs had new flowers delivered every morning. Greg paced slowly along the row of workstations like a drill sergeant inspecting troops. Remember, he said, raising his voice just enough to carry across the office, we may have a very important visitor today. I want professionalism.
No mistakes. No distractions.
His eyes flicked toward me for a fraction of a second when he said the last part. I did not react. Instead, I walked calmly to my desk near the window and sat down. From there, I could see the river cutting through the city blocks below, traffic moving steadily across the bridges. It was a clear day, the kind of day where the skyline looked almost unreal against the blue sky. My computer screen blinked awake when I tapped the keyboard. A few unread emails appeared in the corner. One of them caught my attention immediately. The sender name was simple. Richard Whitmore. I stared at it for a moment before opening it. The message itself was short, exactly the way he always wrote. I will arrive in 15 minutes. Wait for me. I closed the email without replying. Across the aisle, Jason glanced over at me, then leaned back slightly in his chair. Hey, he whispered under his breath, careful not to attract Greg's attention. You handled that pretty well earlier. I shrugged lightly. It is just a floor, I said. Jason studied my face like he was trying to understand something that did not quite make sense. On the other side of the room, Greg was already rehearsing his welcome speech near the glass doors that led to the executive conference area. I could hear fragments of it. Words like growth, partnership, opportunity. He straightened a stack of presentation folders and adjusted his tie again in the reflection of the window. The elevator chimes sounded faintly from the hallway outside the office. A few seconds later, the reception phone rang once, then stopped. Greg turned toward the entrance with the alert expression of a man who believed the most important moment of his career had just arrived. None of them noticed that I had already pushed my chair back and quietly stood up from my desk. I stepped away from my desk just as the glass doors at the entrance of the department opened and a quiet ripple moved through the office. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. Chairs shifted against the polished floor. Everyone instinctively straightened in their seats. Greg Collins immediately walked forward with a confident stride of someone who had been waiting for this moment all morning. Through the glass wall, I could see 3 figures entering from the hallway, led by a tall man in a charcoal gray suit whose presence seemed to change the air in the room the second he stepped inside. Richard Whitmore had a calm way of moving that made people pay attention without him raising his voice or making a dramatic entrance. He simply walked in, and the room adjusted itself around him. 2 assistants followed a few steps behind, carrying slim tablets and folders. Greg reached the doorway first and extended his hand with a wide professional smile. Mr. Whitmore, welcome to Collins and Grant Holdings. We are honored to have you here today. Richard Whitmore shook his hand politely but briefly, his eyes already scanning the office with quiet curiosity. The rest of the staff had stood up by then, forming a loose line of nervous energy around their desks. I remained near my workstation by the window, watching the scene unfold without speaking. Greg launched into the speech he had been practicing earlier. We are very excited to show you how our team operates and the progress we have made this year. I assure you that our workplace maintains the highest professional standards. His voice carried clearly across the room. I noticed Jason glance toward me for a moment before quickly looking back down at his monitor. Richard Whitmore listened for a few seconds, nodding politely while Greg spoke about efficiency, leadership, and company culture. Then his gaze shifted across the room again, slower this time. His eyes passed over the conference table, the rows of desks, the whiteboard filled with financial projections. For a moment, it looked like he was simply taking in the layout of the department. Then his attention stopped. He had noticed the mop bucket still sitting near the supply closet where I had left it a few minutes earlier. The bright yellow plastic stood out against the gray carpet like a warning sign. Greg continued talking, unaware. Our team takes pride in maintaining a professional environment where every employee understands their role and responsibilities. Richard Whitmore turned slightly toward the bucket, then toward the section of the floor that was still drying from the coffee spill. The faint scent of cleaning solution lingered in the air. He looked thoughtful for a second. Then his eyes lifted and settled directly on me. The change was subtle, but I saw it immediately. Recognition moved across his face the way sunlight moves across water. He took a step forward, then another, moving past Greg before the manager could finish his sentence. The room grew even quieter. Greg stopped speaking mid-phrase and turned, confused by the sudden shift in attention. Richard Whitmore walked calmly across the office floor until he stood only a few feet away from where I was standing beside my desk. Up close, his expression softened slightly, the faintest hint of amusement in his eyes. Behind him, the entire department watched in complete silence, unsure what was happening. Greg hurried after him, clearly worried that something had gone wrong with the carefully planned introduction. "Mr. Whitmore, if there is anything you would like to see first, we have prepared a presentation." Richard Whitmore lifted a hand gently, signaling him to pause. His gaze never left me. For a second, neither of us said anything. Then he spoke in a calm, respectful tone that carried clearly across the quiet office.
"Daniel," he said.
For a moment, the entire office remained frozen, as if the room itself had stopped breathing. Richard Whitmore stood only a few feet in front of me, his calm eyes steady and familiar, the faint lines at the corners of his face deepening as a small smile appeared. Behind him, I could feel the weight of dozens of confused stares. Greg Collins looked from Richard Whitmore to me and then back again, clearly trying to understand why the most powerful executive in the room had walked past everyone else just to stop at my desk. "Daniel," Richard Whitmore said again, his voice warm this time, the way someone greets a person they have known for a long time. I nodded once. "Good morning," I replied calmly. The reaction behind him was immediate but silent. Chairs shifted slightly. Someone inhaled sharply. Greg stepped forward quickly, forcing a polite laugh that sounded thin. In the quiet room, "You two have already met?" he asked, his tone uncertain now. Richard Whitmore turned his head slightly toward Greg, but did not answer right away. Instead, he looked around the office again, taking in the desks, the employees, the bright windows, and finally the yellow mop bucket still standing near the supply closet. His gaze lingered there for a second before returning to me. "I was wondering when I would find you," he said. His words were simple, but the way he said them carried a meaning that made the room even quieter than before. Greg shifted his weight uneasily. "Mr. Whitmore, if you would like to begin the presentation, we have prepared a detailed overview of our quarterly results and our expansion strategy." Richard Whitmore raised a hand gently, stopping him without even looking in his direction. Then he spoke again, still addressing me. "I received your message last night," he said. "You did not mention you had already started working here." I shrugged lightly. "I wanted to see the place the same way everyone else does," I said. Jason was staring openly now. Natalie had stopped pretending to work entirely. The assistants who had followed Richard Whitmore into the office exchanged quick glances, but said nothing. Greg's confident posture had begun to soften at the edges, like someone slowly realizing that the situation in front of him did not match the plan he had rehearsed all morning. "I hope the experience has been informative," Richard Whitmore continued calmly. His eyes moved once more toward the still damp section of floor where the coffee had been cleaned. I could almost hear the pieces of the moment falling into place for him. I rested my hand lightly on the back of my chair. "It has been very educational," I said. Greg cleared his throat, trying to regain control of the room. "I am sure Daniel here has been learning a great deal about teamwork and responsibility," he said quickly, his voice now carefully formal. Richard Whitmore slowly turned his head toward him. The expression on his face was not angry, but it was very focused. "Has he asked quietly?" Greg nodded, though the confidence in the gesture was fading quickly. "Absolutely. We believe in making sure new employees understand how things operate from the ground up." Richard Whitmore studied him for a moment, then looked back at me again. The faint smile returned to his face, though there was something thoughtful behind it now. "That is good," he said slowly. Then, in a tone that carried clearly across the silent office, he added a single sentence that made every person in the room stand a little straighter. "After all, Daniel has always believed that the best way to understand a company is to start at the very bottom." The silence that followed felt heavier than anything that had happened earlier that morning. Richard Whitmore's words still hung in the air, and every person in the office seemed to be trying to understand them at the same time. Greg Collins shifted his stance again, the confidence that had carried him through the morning now fading into something tighter and less certain. "Well," Greg said with a forced smile, glancing briefly around the room as if looking for someone to confirm that everything was still under control. "We always encourage initiative here." Richard Whitmore said nothing for a moment. Instead, he slowly walked a few steps toward the window beside my desk, looking out at the Chicago skyline stretching across the bright October morning. The river glimmered far below, and traffic moved steadily across the bridges like quiet streams of silver. He folded his hands behind his back in a relaxed posture that suggested he was in no hurry at all. The assistants behind him waited quietly, tablets still in their hands. The entire department remained standing. Finally, Richard Whitmore turned back toward the room. His gaze moved across the employees one by one, calm but observant. When he spoke again, his voice was measured and clear. "A workplace can reveal a great deal about a company," he said. "Sometimes it reveals things that presentations and reports never show." Greg nodded quickly, eager to agree. "Exactly, that is why we take our culture very seriously." I watched the exchange without speaking. Jason was still staring in my direction, his expression caught somewhere between confusion and realization. Natalie had folded her arms loosely and leaned slightly against her desk, listening carefully. Richard Whitmore took a slow step back toward me. The faint smile returned to his face, though there was a thoughtful look behind it now. "Daniel has always had a particular interest in observing how organizations treat the people who appear to have the least authority," he
said.
His words were calm, but the effect was immediate. Several people in the room shifted uncomfortably. Greg cleared his throat again. "I can assure you that every employee here is valued." Richard Whitmore tilted his head slightly, as if considering that statement. His eyes drifted briefly, once more toward the supply closet where the yellow mop bucket still stood. Then he looked back at Greg. "That is good to hear," he said politely. The room remained silent. For a few seconds, no one moved. Then Richard Whitmore's attention returned to me again, and this time his tone carried a hint of quiet familiarity. "You always preferred to learn by seeing things for yourself," he said. I gave a small nod. "It is the fastest way to understand people." The assistants behind him exchanged another quick glance, though neither of them spoke. Greg's posture had grown noticeably rigid now, the earlier ease completely gone. The situation was slipping beyond anything he had expected. Richard Whitmore finally stepped slightly to the side and gestured lightly toward the conference area across the office. "Perhaps we should continue this discussion in the meeting room," he said. Then he paused for half a second before adding something that caused another ripple of tension across the floor. "Daniel, would you join us?" For a brief moment, no one in the office moved. Richard Whitmore's invitation seemed to travel slowly across the room before it settled over everyone standing there. Greg Collins blinked twice as if he had misheard something. The conference room he had carefully prepared all morning had been meant for executives, not for a junior analyst who had been mopping the floor less than 15 minutes earlier. Yet Richard Whitmore was still standing there calmly, waiting. I pushed my chair in and stepped away from my desk without rushing. The sound of my shoes against the polished floor was quiet, but noticeable in the silence. Jason watched me pass with wide eyes, while Natalie gave a small nod that looked half surprised and half impressed. Greg quickly forced another polite smile and gestured toward the glass conference room across the department. "Of course," he said, trying to recover his professional tone. "Right this way." The group began moving across the office floor. Richard Whitmore walked beside me with an easy stride, while Greg hurried slightly ahead to pull open the door to the conference room. Inside, the long walnut table was already set with presentation folders, bottled water, and a large screen displaying the company logo. Everything looked perfectly arranged, exactly the way Greg had intended earlier that morning. As everyone took their seats, Greg positioned himself at the head of the table near the screen. I chose a chair halfway down the table beside the window. Richard Whitmore sat across from me, resting his hands lightly on the polished surface. His assistants settled quietly near the end of the table, opening their tablets, but saying nothing. Greg cleared his throat and straightened his tie again before beginning his presentation. "As I mentioned earlier," he said, clicking a remote that brought the first slide onto the screen, "Collins and Grant Holdings has experienced consistent growth over the past 5 years." Charts and graphs filled the display behind him. Revenue lines rising steadily. Market projections. Expansion plans. Greg spoke confidently, explaining numbers and strategies with the enthusiasm of someone determined to impress the most powerful person in the room. Richard Whitmore listened politely, occasionally nodding but rarely interrupting. His attention seemed divided between the presentation and the quiet atmosphere of the room itself. After several minutes, Greg paused and looked toward him expectantly. "We believe our operational model makes us an ideal partner for future expansion," he said. Richard Whitmore leaned back slightly in his chair. For a moment, he studied the chart on the screen. Then he turned his head and looked directly at me. "Daniel," he said calmly, "you have been here for 3 weeks now, correct?" I nodded. "Yes." Greg glanced toward me quickly, clearly uncertain why the conversation had shifted in that direction. Richard Whitmore continued in the same relaxed tone. "I would be interested to hear your observations." The room went completely still again. Greg's remote hovered halfway between his hand and the table. Jason and Natalie were visible through the glass wall outside the conference room, both pretending to work but clearly watching what was happening. I rested my hands lightly on the table and considered the question for a moment. Then I spoke. "The numbers are strong," I said. "But numbers do not always show how a company actually functions." The words settled over the conference table, and the quiet that followed felt heavier than before. Greg Collins remained standing near the screen, with the presentation remote still in his hand, his confident rhythm broken for the first time since the meeting had started. Richard Whitmore leaned back slightly in his chair and watched me with the same calm expression he had carried since walking into the office. Outside the glass wall of the conference room, the rest of the department had clearly noticed that something unusual was happening. Jason had stopped typing entirely, and Natalie pretended to review a document while her attention stayed fixed on the room. Greg cleared his throat carefully and forced a polite smile that looked tighter than before. "Well," he said, trying to steer the conversation back toward familiar ground, "every company has room for improvement, but our leadership structure ensures that employees understand expectations and responsibilities." Richard Whitmore said nothing. His eyes remained on me, waiting. I rested my hands lightly on the table and spoke calmly. "The numbers show efficiency," I said, "but culture shows character." Greg shifted his stance slightly. "And our culture is built on accountability," he replied quickly. I nodded once. "Accountability is important," I said, "but respect is equally important." The room grew quiet again. Richard Whitmore's assistants exchanged a brief glance, but kept their attention on their tablets. Greg set the presentation remote down on the table as if the device had suddenly become less important. "I believe our employees are treated fairly," he said, though the certainty in his voice had weakened. I turned my gaze toward the glass wall where the office floor was visible beyond the conference room. The yellow mop bucket was still standing near the supply closet, bright and impossible to ignore. Then I looked back at the table. "Earlier this morning," I said calmly, "a situation happened on the office floor that may help explain my observation." Greg's shoulders stiffened slightly. Richard Whitmore's expression remained neutral, though his eyes sharpened with quiet interest. I continued speaking at the same measured pace. A coffee spill was discovered near the conference area. Instead of addressing the situation as a shared responsibility, the decision was made to assign the task publicly to the newest employee in the room. No one interrupted. Greg shifted his weight again and folded his arms, trying to appear composed. "Maintaining standards is part of professional discipline," he said. "New hires often start with simple responsibilities so they can understand how things operate." Richard Whitmore slowly turned his head toward him, listening carefully. I kept my voice steady. "Cleaning a floor is not the issue," I said. "Every job in a company deserves respect. The real issue is the message that is sent when authority is used to create humiliation instead of leadership." The silence that followed felt deeper than any moment earlier that day. Richard Whitmore tapped one finger lightly against the polished surface of the table as he considered the words. Greg looked toward the door briefly, as if hoping the conversation might somehow drift away from the direction it had taken. Instead, Richard Whitmore finally spoke again, his tone thoughtful but clear. "Leadership," he said slowly, "is often revealed in the smallest moments. Then his gaze moved from Greg back to me. And sometimes those moments tell the entire story. The quiet in the conference room lingered for several seconds after Richard Whitmore spoke. No one moved. The words had settled into the room like a weight that no one wanted to disturb. Greg Collins slowly picked up the presentation remote again, but did not press any buttons. The screen behind him still displayed the chart of rising revenue lines, but the numbers now seemed strangely irrelevant compared to the conversation unfolding at the table. Richard Whitmore rested his hands calmly on the polished wood surface and glanced once toward the glass wall of the conference room. Outside, several employees were clearly pretending to work while their attention remained fixed on the meeting. Jason leaned slightly closer to his monitor, but his eyes kept drifting toward the room. Natalie had stopped typing completely. Richard Whitmore returned his attention to Greg. His voice remained steady, almost conversational, but the meaning behind it carried quiet authority. When I evaluate a company, he said, I look beyond reports and forecasts. Those things are useful, but they only show what people want others to see. Greg nodded quickly. Of course. Transparency and accountability are values we take seriously. Richard Whitmore studied him for a moment. Then he spoke again, slower this time. Real leadership appears when no one expects to be evaluated. Greg's posture tightened slightly. The confident rhythm he had carried earlier in the morning was gone now, replaced by careful caution. I remained seated with my hands resting lightly on the table, watching the exchange unfold. Richard Whitmore turned his gaze back toward me briefly.
You
chose not to reveal who you were when you arrived here, he said. It was not a question. I nodded once. I wanted an honest view of how the company operates. Greg blinked. The sentence seemed to land differently for him than it had for everyone else. Richard Whitmore continued calmly. Daniel has always believed that titles and positions can sometimes prevent people from seeing the truth. Greg's expression shifted slightly as the meaning of the words began to settle in. He looked from Richard Whitmore to me, and then back again. I am not sure I understand, he said carefully. Richard Whitmore folded his hands together. 3 weeks ago, he said, Daniel asked if he could spend time observing several companies that Whitmore Global has been evaluating. The assistants at the end of the table remained silent, though one of them quietly turned her tablet, so the screen faced Richard Whitmore. Greg's confusion deepened. Observing, he repeated. Richard Whitmore nodded once.
Yes.
Observing how leadership decisions affect everyday employees. Greg glanced again toward the glass wall where the office floor was visible. His eyes stopped briefly on the yellow mop bucket still near the supply closet. The realization that had been forming slowly throughout the meeting finally reached his expression. Richard Whitmore spoke one final sentence in the same calm tone he had used since the beginning of the meeting. Daniel is not here, as a junior analyst. The words hung in the air for a second before he finished the thought. He is here representing Whitmore Global. The words remained suspended in the air for several seconds, and in that silence the entire atmosphere of the room changed. Greg Collins did not speak immediately. His eyes moved slowly from Richard Whitmore to me, as if he was replaying the events of the morning in his mind one piece at a time. The polished conference table reflected the light from the tall windows, and beyond the glass wall the rest of the office floor had become almost completely still. Jason had stopped pretending to work altogether now. Natalie sat motionless at her desk, her attention fixed entirely on the meeting room. Richard Whitmore remained calm, his posture relaxed, as if the conversation had simply reached its natural conclusion. Greg finally cleared his throat, though his voice carried far less confidence than it had earlier. I see, he said carefully. Well, that is certainly unexpected. No one responded to the comment. I rested my hands lightly on the table and looked across the room toward the glass wall where the bright yellow mop bucket still stood, near the supply closet. The faint scent of cleaning solution lingered in the air, even here in the conference room. Richard Whitmore followed my gaze briefly before turning his attention back to Greg. Unexpected situations often reveal the most valuable information, he said calmly. Greg nodded once, though the gesture looked stiff. Our intention has always been to maintain high standards, he replied. Richard Whitmore studied him for a moment without speaking. Then he leaned forward slightly, resting his forearms on the table. His voice remained steady, but the meaning behind his words was unmistakable. High standards are important, he said. But how a company treats its newest employee often tells you everything about how it will treat everyone else. The sentence settled quietly across the table. Greg's shoulders lowered slightly as the weight of the moment became impossible to ignore. For several seconds, the only sound in the room was the faint hum of the air conditioning system above us. Finally, Richard Whitmore straightened in his chair and gave a small nod, as if confirming a decision that had already been forming throughout the morning. Whitmore Global values organizations where leadership is demonstrated through respect and responsibility, he said. Greg listened without interrupting. I remained silent beside the window, watching the skyline beyond the glass as sunlight reflected across the river below. Richard Whitmore stood up slowly from his chair. His assistants closed their tablets and rose as well. Thank you for your time this morning, he said politely. Greg stood quickly, though his earlier confidence was gone. Of course, he replied. Richard Whitmore turned toward the door of the conference room and paused for a brief moment. Then he looked back at me with the same calm expression he had carried since entering the office. Daniel, he said, I believe we have seen enough. I nodded once and stood as well. As we stepped out of the conference room together, the entire department looked up from their desks. No one spoke. Richard Whitmore walked calmly toward the elevators, and I followed beside him. Behind us, Greg Collins remained standing inside the conference room, staring silently at the empty chair where the morning's presentation had begun, now fully aware that the smallest moment of the day had turned out to be the most important one.